Hello everyone and welcome to CMI Race, Getting Terminology Right. My name's Matt Jays and today we'll be joined with Daljit Kaur, CMI Race Advisory Committee member, Scarlett Luer, Associate Director at Ipsos Mori and Deputy Chair of their Race, Ethnicity and Cultural Heritage Network, and Cully Kaur Balagan, Senior Director within the Social Research Division of Ipsos Mori. So we've received a large number of questions in advance, so thanks to everyone who's done that, and we'll be structuring our conversation today around some of those and following up with additional resources for many of those that we won't have time to cover in 1 hour today. But if you do have questions during the webinar, then please do use them, the live chat box to ask those, and we'll be trying to answer as many as we can. And do obviously let us know where you're dialing in from today as well and talk amongst yourselves. We're keen to get the conversation started. And finally, today's session is being recorded and will be shared with all of those who booked to attend. And the event recording will also be available on the CMI website and the CMI YouTube channel. And obviously, if you're a CMI member, please don't forget to log into Management Direct to record your attendance as part of your continuous professional development, or CPD. So that's the introduction from me, and I'm delighted to be joined by my panel. So hello, everybody.
Hi.
Hi. Hi, Matt.
Hi, hi. And we're just going to quickly kind of frame the discussion, I think, because it's obviously a really broad topic, terminology, and we've got a huge amount to get through, as we've discussed. But really, the context is that government has recently been advised to disaggregate the term BAME, which is obviously an umbrella term for ethnic groups described as Black, Asian, and minority ethnic. And the reason they've been advised this is to better focus on understanding disparities and outcomes for specific ethnic groups. So that will be a large proportion of what we talk about today. But before we dive into that in more detail, I think it's kind of useful to remind ourselves that race and ethnic disparities aren't limited to the UK. And in fact, actually, an Ipsos survey for the World Economic Forum this year found that across 27 countries surveyed, an average of 65% of all adults think that in their country, someone's race, ethnicity, or national origin influences their employment opportunities. So I think there are some good top-level terms to start off with: race, ethnicity, cultural heritage, and national origin. So already quite a lot to cover. But Daljit, if I perhaps start with you. So the scientific concept of race has been discredited, but the term itself is used socially and is defined legally in the UK's Equality Act 2010. And we know that some people experience racism, and the Commission's report on race and ethnic disparities recently refers to institutional, systemic, and structural forms of racism. I wonder if you could help explain these terms briefly and why they matter to organisations, leaders, and managers who want to prioritise anti-racism.
Okay, I'll do my best, Matt. Complicated terms. Okay, I'd like to start by saying that we need to be sensitive in the terminology that we use and the way we talk about race and ethnicity. So when you look at those three particular terms, institutional, structural, and systematic. Institutional, well, we had the Stephen Lawrence report that opened up a can of worms. We're still dealing with a lot of challenges from a policy, process, and behaviour perspective. But then when you go into language like structured and systematic, there's an overlap. It's to do with the way we behave in society. It's to do with policy, practice, and behaviour. And it's historic. How do you change that when we know it's evolving and adapting? Race is adapting all the time in terms of the isms, if you like. As the demographic changes, society changes. So that does come into it. So I do feel that we need to be wider in our approach in terms of conversations. But think about the interconnectivity. And those that feel excluded or not part of what's going on around you are the minority groups, because there isn't a sense of belonging. You try, but there's discrimination and we don't challenge it. We have policy and practice in place, but I also feel that culture, tradition, values and beliefs also need to be taken into consideration in that wider debate, hence the language challenge. So I would say that, and it actually takes me back to the Council Review, which was very much about creating a local belonging, a sense of belonging, and understanding what was going on around us demographically, nationally, globally. So language is important, but we need to create an environment where we can have an honest debate. And what should the language be? BAME's not right. People that I've spoke to from a minority group don't even like the terminology ethnic minority. So that it is an uncomfortable area still. But I do feel that we need to decide and explore, but based on what we need as an organisation.
Absolutely. And we're obviously going to move the conversation into both ending BAME and, as you say, whether ethnic minority is a better term. So that's really interesting, and especially let's pull out some of the points you made there on belonging and cultural heritage and cohesion. So Scarlett, perhaps you could start by taking us back to 2019 when you co-founded the REACH, or Race, Ethnicity and Cultural Heritage Network at Ipsos Mori. So I guess kind of how deliberate was your choice of terms used to describe the group and its work? And could you give any practical examples of how they differ and relate to one another in the way you approach your work?
Yeah, no problem. I'm happy to share. It's a bit of a mouthful when you're trying to say the name a bit. But for us, it was a very deliberate choice to name our network REACH, which is Race, Ethnicity and Cultural Heritage. To launch our network at that time, we had several workshops, and we spent quite some time discussing what would be the best name for us. And at that time, most organizations which already had networks like that supporting their like ethnic minority employees are all called BAME network or BAME support group. We ran this idea with the people who joined our network at that time, just to check what they think about, like, if we get called the BAME network at Ipsos. And most people in that meeting didn't feel like this will resonate with them at all. Actually, quite a lot of them felt like they didn't even know what BAME meant. And some think it meant Black and minority ethnic, which is Black, Asian, and minority ethnic. So we moved away from that idea. And then we agreed we wanted a name that is positive sounding and uplifting, because we want to be in a workplace, a force that drives positive changes and also celebrate diversity rather than also as well as tackling issues. So BAME by definition is exclusive of white colleagues in the company who we want them to be a important part of working together with us to make these changes and progresses. So yeah, we don't want to exclude them. And also the cultural element is also very important. You can't really separate that from ethnicity when you're talking about these important issues. So that's why we came up with the name REACH, included all that. And with REACH, it allowed us to discuss topics that more specifically relate to race and ethnicity, such as we had a guest speaker come into our network, talk about Black Lives Matter, etc. And also we celebrate a lot of cultural events at Ipsos, such as Diwali, Chinese New Year, and Ramadan, etc. So with this inclusive name, more people feel like they can join and be part of it. Oh, I think Matt, are you frozen?
That's a really good point that you've made there, Scarlett. So, Cully, you're actually leading with regards to immigration at the moment, and amongst other topics. Would you like to say a little around that?
Yeah, first of all, thank you everybody for joining in. And I think it's great that we're actually having this conversation. And I think we've moved to a point now in society where we are much more open about having these conversations. So I think this is a great kind of, step forward in some ways. So like you say, Delja, I've been sort of researching these issues around immigration, identity, kind of, for several decades now, like yourself. And I think, there's lots of terms used. We talk about kind of people who come to live in the country, immigrants, and quite often people conflate asylum, immigration. But when we talk about nationality, citizenship, national identity, it's quite important to kind of define what we mean, although a lot of the time in kind of discussion groups, research, people tend to use them interchangeably. I would say first and foremost, citizenship is effectively just a legal status. It's about kind of being a citizen of a particular state, nation, etc. So it's very much, I believe, a legalistic term. Whereas nationality is something that you're either born with, or that you can acquire through citizenship. So something that's quite fluid. You know, person who comes, for example, kind of comes from India, lives in, you know, like my parents, moves to the UK, gets naturalized as a British citizen. So, you know, it can change. And actually what we saw with Brexit, people taking up dual nationalities. So they would have, you know, kind of lots of suddenly taking up Irish citizenship as well. So, you know, it's something that can change and can be acquired. And it's something also that you're born with. I think national identity is something potentially more sort of, I say, I mean, they're all complex concepts in some ways, but you know, that's much more, I believe, self-defined. And we kind of, or when we ask it, certainly in the UK, it's very much, you know, about which of the 4 nations you potentially identify with most, or whether it's British identity that you identify. And we, you know, we quite often find in a lot of our research, you know, Scottish national identity is very strong amongst Scottish people. Whereas I think you don't tend to see that so much in terms of English identity, national identity, although it's getting stronger. But people, I think the umbrella term there is the British identity tends to be much stronger. So there's lots of different aspects to sort of nationality, citizenship. And I think the other thing I would just say is, you know, we talk about, you know, this is all about sort of labels and language. And we're going to talk about this in more detail, but I do think it's important to note that people can have multiple identities and multiple nationalities. So it's not easy to just put people in a single box. And I think that's something we've, you know, I think we're better at, but I think it is, you know, always important to point that out to people.
Thanks ever so much, and apologies I left very briefly, but Daljit continued the conversation, as I can tell. Thanks ever so much for that, both of you. And we did actually, as I say, receive pre-submitted questions, and one of those that came through was actually, you know, what is the panel's view on the conflation of ethnicity and nationality? So, Scarlett, could I perhaps come over to you first for your view?
Yeah, so I think that the conflation obviously has historical reason, as Kali mentioned. You know, probably for the first settler of a lot of the ethnic minority groups in the UK, when they first came to the country, they are from a different country, and to identify them, then they need to have a name for this ethnic group. Then usually it's associated to the country they come from. But then for then like for me, myself, I'm a first generation immigrant. I consider that. So so I still think, you know, I'm not actually a British citizen, but I'm settled here, have settled status. So I'm not British national, but I'm also an ethnic group settled in the UK. But then for some other Chinese community in the UK, they could be the second generation or third generation who's stayed here. And then for them, they might not have much connection with like China, or, you know, this Chinese identity that has to do with nationality. So I think this conflation is kind of like inevitable, because it had to happen to start with. But now I think it's important for people who are actually British, born British, and grow up in this country to maybe put a little bit more focus on their British identity as well. So like people will be like British Chinese or British Indian, something like that, so to differentiate from people like me, who is Chinese from China. Hope that makes sense.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing your own personal experience and thoughts on that one. And Daljit, over to you on the same question.
Okay. It's complex, isn't it? Because it depends on where our identity, our heritage is, our roots. And I think that's really important. So language is crucial. But when I speak to people, British-born generations, they still say, I'm Pakistani or Indian, or so. But I was saying, but you were born here. No. So that whole sense of belonging and where do you fit is still a real challenge, especially around representation in the workforce as well. And just to add to complexities, we need to think about the journey and the history of the language. So we've had Black, we've had BAME, we've had BAME, and so on. And language is evolving, as are the demographics around us. And I think we wear lots of different hats or layers depending on where we're at. So when somebody asks me to describe myself, I say, well, I have to say a human being because I fit into so many boxes now. I think I don't want to be in a box, but I do want to be recognised for what I can do. So I think that is quite an important aspect that we need to look at. So identity and nationality is important, but what I'm finding is people associate more with heritage, demographic, where I feel people are changing with time and place, depending on what generation they are. So it's quite an interesting angle for me.
Absolutely. And we've got lots of comments coming in of people joining us from various places. At the moment, it looks predominantly across the UK. So do let us know where you're dialing in from. And obviously do use the opportunity as well to pose questions on the panel's answers and any questions that you may have more broadly on the topic as well. So Cully, just before we move on to another pre-submitted question, I suppose, kind of anything to add from that in terms of your research and Ipsos Mori's work?
Yeah, I mean, I think quite often it sort of fundamentally boils down. This conversation is sparked by the census question, and we've done lots of work with that, and I know ONS have done lots of work with that, because we're trying to categorise people in a sort of standardised box, and we'll come on to why that actually is quite useful in some ways and necessary to measure things. But like Scarlett says, I think what we have in terms of the census question is not perfect. I've had people complain internally in Ipsos Mori saying, well, I'm not Pakistani, I'm British, or I'm South Asian. I wouldn't describe myself as Pakistani, which is a fair point because it's very much about self-identity. So I think the way that sort of census question has obviously come together is over time, the kind of the history of migration, etc., and the biggest groups that were in Britain and how they've kind of evolved. So I think we do conflate the two, but we need to be sensitive to that. You can't put everyone in one box, and people do have multiple identities at the same time. There may be cases, and you take a pragmatic view, that having some kind of standardized measures or some form of identity where people can we can collect data essentially to look at and we're going to discuss this in more detail, is important. But I think it's important. I think it's an evolving thing. That said, there seems to be no consensus on what the improvement should be. So I think we're sort of slightly stuck in a place where this is kind of the best we have at the moment. But as things evolve, maybe we change it.
Yeah, really interesting. And obviously one of the points in moving the dial on race as well, in the practical guide that CMI published, was this idea that collecting data is imperfect but important. But it's the role of the manager to actually have those conversations with their team members about how they prefer to be described or identify themselves. So yeah, really, really great points there. And actually comments are flying in, and we've got audience joining us from all over the world. Actually, I was wrong, not just the UK, which perhaps leads us neatly into the next pre-submitted question. So many from ethnically diverse backgrounds see themselves as the global majority rather than being defined as a minority in all discourse. And so what's the panel's perspective on this? So perhaps if we go around in the other order this time and start with you, Cully, what's your perspective on global majority?
Yeah. Well, I'm of Indian heritage, so globally I would not be in a minority group, I think, given the that said, growing up and being born in Britain, I am part of a minority population. So I think it's really tricky again. Yeah, it's kind of what context you kind of look at it in, and obviously my working life, my kind of, my day-to-day business is all in the UK, in Britain. So I think in terms of what policies impact on me personally, how I sort of interact with others in the workplace, I'm very much defined by, not defined by being in a minority, but that's how I think others would see me. That said, yeah, I don't think people tend to think globally. Actually, quite often, I think they tend to take very, very locally, and I think that's kind of people's starting point. But yeah.
Fantastic. Daljeet, there's direct questions coming for you, but perhaps before we move to those, your thoughts on the same question, global majority. Is it a better term?
I've got mixed views on it. I teach students globally and internationally, so they see themselves as being part of a global community, and I encourage my students to see themselves as being global. as a way of interconnecting and interacting and learning about one another. Otherwise, we're still going to live in segregated worlds. I think we need to have a conversation, and I've got mixed views, similar to Cully, parents from India, born in the UK, and so on, but still trying to find a sense of belonging. And I feel that within the workforce, it's about moving from margins to mainstream. I've had that debate before, and that is about policy and practice. It's really making a difference where you've got representation, but support managers and leaders to have those conversations and put things in place that are practical. So that's my perspective on it.
Thanks so much. Scarlett, over to you. Your thoughts?
Yes, maybe just very quickly, because I actually had a slightly different experience from Kali and Daja, because I was growing up in China. So I am Han Chinese, so I'm the majority, you know, Han Chinese, the biggest ethnic group in the whole world. So, but then moving to the UK, I actually become, you know, a minority, because according to 2011 census, there's only 0.7% population in the UK Chinese. So this is like a change for me from a majority where everything in the society kind of like designed for you, and come to a society where you have to navigate. First, for me, first years before I settled, I have to navigate myself as a foreign national first. I think that actually played a bigger impact on the things I need to do to rather than my ethnicity. But then after I settled, and then the things actually from my ethnic background may be more important now. So for me, like if you're just thinking, if UN need to run a research project and look at the population of the world, you know, how they define what is majority and what is minority will be very different from if we are running a research project in the UK locally. And because every country, every region has so many differences. I heard what Daja said about the global citizen, the global perspective, but it's also a very complicated and messy topic. If we actually want to make some real progress, have something concrete to happen, we have to look at more locally, based on the UK society, what can we do to actually make progress for the marginalized or underrepresented group in the UK.
Fantastic point, and very neatly leads us into our next topic, because obviously one of the things that has already been mentioned, especially by Kali, and in our Moving the Dial on Race guide, is, you know, the way to make the difference is to obviously start with the data. So we know that collecting data is complex. We've already touched upon that, and there's lots of questions and comments coming through about BAME and what to replace it with. We've had lots of pre-submitted questions from, you know, what is the correct term to use now? Are we dropping the term BAME? Ultimately, who gets to decide the terminology that should be used? And when considering the terminology, are representatives from all races and other global cultures consulted? So lots and lots of questions coming through about this. And I thought perhaps the best way to start us off would be Scarlett and Cully. Within the context of these questions, could I ask you to talk us through Ipsos Mori's consultative approach to moving away from the collective term BAME? And for example, how did REACH feed into this work?
Sure. Cully, maybe I can start, talk about the network, and then you can dive into the research part a little bit more. So from our network perspective, we firstly had a discussion within our working group of like 13 of us in our network to hear people's view on this. And we kind of like agreed on that the term BAME is not really helpful and no longer very relevant to address real issues. So then after that, we ran an internal poll, as we're a polling company, you know. We did that. At that time, some of our clients actually started to use a phrase called ethnically diverse. So we kind of like give people a few options like ethnic diverse or BAME or other, you know, different options, like see what our network actually think what is the best term. And we found out people dislike ethnically diverse even more than BAME because it's just they found that terms confusing. And then from that poll, we also like many people suggested ethnic minority would be a better alternative in this case. So then we had a chat with our CEO to present to him our findings, and then we're going to then move ahead with making this change within Ipsos as an organization. And obviously, Cully is leading on writing the guide and how we're going to do research. Cully, over to you.
Thank you, Scarlett. Yeah, so following on from that, we set up a specific research group that was to kind of look at how Ipsos Mori conducts its research to make it more inclusive, to make sure we use the right terminology. And that then helps the basis for advising clients, because I think what we found is a lot of clients were coming to us and saying, well, what terminology should we would be using? You know, can you help us, kind of thing. So I went away and spoke to a few colleagues, spoke to stakeholders in the field, you know, key think tanks, groups, key individuals, also lots of internal discussions. I think it's important to remember that there was actually government guidance on some of this before the Sewell report came out as well. So kind of collected all that together and drew up some guidance for internal, you know, essentially a bit of a style guide for how we discuss it, how we talk about it, how we present it in our reports. And that was sort of the basis of the discussion. But I think, you know, even in doing so, we found there was no consensus over a lot of terms. So we very much see it as a sort of living document that will be updated as the language evolves. But we have officially sort of moved away from the term BAME. We are currently using the term ethnic minorities. That is still problematic for some people. So, and one of the reasons, given that the nature of the work we do, you know, our clients do want to look at data, do want to look at groups, and you know, we do, just from a practical level, if we want to look at, you know, statistical differences, unfortunately, there still is a need for some kind of umbrella term. Otherwise, I think we will lose some of the findings. I think the key thing would be to try and always be as specific as possible. And if that's not possible, take a pragmatic approach, which is what we're currently doing. But that's not to say it won't change in the future.
Absolutely. And Daljit, your thoughts on taking a consultative approach?
Yeah, what I've done is I've actually started a consultation process at Ashiana. And Ashiana is a women's organisation that supports women and children fleeing domestic violence, grooming and trafficking. So started having a conversation with users and staff. And overwhelmingly what I'm being told is that users and staff felt uncomfortable with the language of being labelled. They felt negative, they felt it put them in a box that wasn't a true reflection of what they could do from a service point of view. And we've started moving towards the discussion around ethnic minority, because staff and users felt that white people needed to be included within that grouping, not left outside. So that whole minority-majority debate was quite an interesting one, politically, where people fell within that. So that was quite an interesting one. And then what I found is that we need to have deeper conversations. And what we might do in the end as a board of trustees is have the umbrella term. As Cully said, you need to collect data for evidencing of what you're doing for funders, for your services overall, but then create another strand within our structure that allows for that discussion around a wider identity. So you're not confined, and it allows for the wider debate around culture. And even amongst our staff, which are all women, providing support for women, all from diverse backgrounds, it's quite controversial, again, their own perceptions of language and behaviour. So that's interesting. And also, my last point, a lot of people didn't know what the language BAME meant, or even the Equalities Act. They knew it was there, but not sure how it would support them. So I'm collecting good data, hoping to share that with the CMI as part of a case study in the third sector.
Fantastic. And it brings us very neatly to our midway point, if you can believe that. So we're halfway through this conversation. There's a great conversation going on in comments about equality and equity. And I know that there are certain terms used that we could go into more detail on. So do keep those comments and conversations going in the chat in case we don't have time to cover all terminology that obviously is important in this space. And it's great to see obviously everyone interacting with one another on that. You know, we've had some questions in advance, as I say, and also Emily has commented as well to say it's important to understand the difference between minority and minoritized for any identity or characteristic. The latter implies there are forces at play that actively marginalize. So I think that's a really interesting comment from Emily, and we'll move on to ethnic minority as a topic of conversation, as you say, Cully. But just before we do move on, and I think it is important to really kind of dive into the data collection in a little more detail. You know, so we've talked about disaggregating BAME, and one of the questions that was asked was, you know, it was never intended as an identity in itself, but a way of, as you say, gathering and reporting on data. So what do you think the impact will be on data collection and action around outcomes by the move to disaggregating away from BAME or Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic? So Cully, could I come to you on that one first?
Yeah. I actually think one of the reasons it sort of suddenly became quite a prominent and more widely used kind of term during the pandemic, suddenly, you know, because there were these disparities how different groups experienced and were affected by the pandemic, and suddenly it became, you know, much more commonly used term. I think, having said that, I think there's been, you know, lots of good research on that. Actually, you know, we might be quite concerned with this. Actually, there's a lot of the general public who don't really talk about it in those terms day to day. You know, that's not how they describe themselves. But on the point of data, as I think, as I've said before, you know, it is important to disaggregate, be as specific as possible. You know, if we've got because as we've seen in education, there are very different outcomes between different ethnic groups. So I think it's important we understand that. We understand, you know, so if we can't measure things, we don't know what's going on. That said, and I'll give an example of Ipsos Mori has published its ethnicity pay gap. You know, we don't have enough. We have a large, I think, minority employee population, but it's not large enough that we can do the ethnicity pay gap for each individual ethnic group. So in that sense, you know, for that purpose, we needed an ethnic, you know, an umbrella term. And there is still a difference. So we're still highlighting the issue. It may not be the entire picture, but I think it's a good starting point to start understanding what the issues are. And maybe, you know, as a good researcher, you have the numbers, but then you could do other types of research to then follow up and understand maybe some of the nuances and the picture behind those overall numbers. So I really do think, you know, I don't want to abandon, you know, all kind of umbrella terms for the sake of it, sort of throwing out, you know, the baby with the bathwater, as it were, because I think if we do, we might dilute some, you know, we might lose some of the things that are going on, and so understanding some of the issues that particular groups face. That said, it's not always helpful to have umbrella terms. So are there other ways we can investigate sort of differences by ethnic groups? And you know, a survey may not always be the perfect answer, but I think it's a good starting point. Sorry.
Absolutely, really interesting, and I think, you know, we've got a lot to cover today, as I mentioned. I think, you know, the ethnicity pay reporting conversation is a really good practical example of where, you know, reporting on a binary basis due to sample sizes is important, but the analysis that organizations take internally is so crucial to really driving those outcomes that the question referred to. And going into that greater detail, especially on representation in management and leadership and senior roles. So really interesting and great practical example there. And I think, you know, it leads us very neatly into a comment that we received in advance regarding the term Asian specifically. Now, I know this is a topic that we've discussed in some to some extent already. But using this as an example, I guess kind of bringing it back to what managers can do to bridge the gap between terms used for data collection and analysis and the language we use in practice when speaking to colleagues. How do managers do that when the organization is reporting in terms of, let's say, Asian employees, whereas actually, again, this conversation around identity? So Scarlett, can I perhaps come to you on that one first?
Yeah, Cool. Yeah, because I think Kali has already covered it very well in terms of like data reporting point of view. But I think for a line manager, if you just want to deal with the situation on a day-to-day with a colleague, the easiest and best thing to do is just to ask your colleagues how they want to be addressed, because you can't really tell by looking at their face just to know what their identity is, or you probably will get it wrong. So if you're not sure, or if they didn't tell you already, just ask them. And I don't think anyone would, well, some people might have addressed the people as a BAME, but that should never be the case, because that is not any particular individual's identity at all. So yeah, so ask them how they want to be called, identified, is the easiest to do in speaking with colleagues.
Absolutely. And Daljiet, anything to add on that? Tips for line managers and broaching the terminology?
Tip for line managers is, let's have a discussion strategically. Let's lead it, not be afraid of leading it. But at the same time, have the uncomfortable conversations and ask staff what they prefer, going back to what my colleagues have said as a language, and work within that rather than boxing people. I think psychologically it's automatically done because that's the way policy and practice has worked. And I feel that HR have a role here as well to support, to enable and engage, but in a proactive way. But it's making a commitment personally to human rights of an individual and respect.
Absolutely, absolutely. Kali, anything to add, or should...
No, I just agree with sort of Daljiet's point about as well. It's got to, as managers, and I've seen this in our organisation. I think I think people just don't want to do the wrong thing, but they don't know what to do. So it's almost like they're sort of crippled into sort of this fear that they can't talk about it. So I think first of all, it's got to come from the top. Like Daljiet said, HR. Our CEO was very much on board, very open to listening to what the Reach group sort of advised. Also wanted evidence of that, before making any changes. So it's always good to get the evidence. But I think, and then that needs to then filter through to the organisation. And you've got to have, I think, internally at manager level, senior level, have those conversations. And everyone kind of needs to be on board and understand why we're doing this. It's not just a sort of paper exercise to make us look good. It's about making sure our employees can be who they are at work.
Absolutely. We've had a great comment come through, actually, which brings us into kind of the next topic, which perhaps starts to relate to allyship a little more as well. So Sally Brooks has commented to say, I'm always slightly wary of the emotional labour. I, as a white colleague, am asking of an ethnic minority colleague about how best we approach the language around their ethnicity. So interesting comment there, and I wonder if we kind of expand it out a little bit more as well when we talk about the staff networks, and obviously Scarlett with the Reach network at Ipsos Mori, this idea of emotional labour. Perhaps we can try and unpack that term and what it means in practice. So perhaps Scarlett, if I could come to you on that one first. I'm not sure.
Sorry, I just missed the last 10 seconds. Would you mind quickly just repeat the last 10 seconds? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, sure. So the comment was about emotional labour. The idea that obviously people from diverse ethnic groups or ethnic minorities are putting in the labour around this conversation and race equity at work. So I guess, expanding that out slightly broadly to staff networks as well, if we could perhaps offer our opinions or thoughts on what the term emotional labour means and what it means in practice.
Yeah, well, I think, I definitely agree. Some people may feel like, they're already like disadvantaged some way. If I actually have to create more work for them, it sounds terrible. But I think the issue we have a lot of times in this society, in the UK society, is people's hesitancy in talking about race and ethnicity. These issues are very important to be discussed. And it is not, I don't personally think that will give me an emotional labor and doing hard work, but to engage and to actually have a good conversation to to have better understanding is very important, because that will eventually help all different groups to be able to work together better. So I don't think that is emotional labor. That's something that as a network we try to drive, is to make people feel comfortable talking about race, talking about ethnicity.
Absolutely. And Daljit, and the same question to you and your experience and your varied career actually around around emotional labor.
It's complex and it's a journey. So I'm part of lots of networks, obviously, as a university, our CMI one, and the charity. So I've started the debate in the charity in terms of the language approach and what does it mean for you as an individual. So, for example, if I just use myself as an example, I work in a very big higher education sector, university. It's complex. I go to work to do a job, but I don't see myself as being different. I see myself as contributing to bring about change. However, it's almost as though people feel they need to put me in a box. So gender, race, disability, and so on. So trying to pick that and say, well, let's start as human beings and then take it from there. It's complex. I've spoken to lots of people that feel that they're not able to progress to leaders or manager role because of the identity or the behaviour, but we automatically do it. I've been part of this movement to bring about change for the next generations, if you like, to have that conversation, because I think we should all be having the conversation. It just shouldn't be the ethnic minority, but all of us together. So going back to Sally's point, she should be able to have a conversation rather than thinking, oh, I need to think about this or where does this person fit? No, let's think of it in terms of action planning, workforce planning, and talking to our customer. Our demographics so different and diverse. Within our charity, we've got the Albanian community. My learning, wow, in terms of their perceptions of ethnic minorities from a colour perspective, has been quite interesting. But again, it means we've got to have conversations to break down some of the barriers.
Callie, sorry, were you coming in on that?
Yeah, I was just a point that sort of made me think that, about sort of the emotional labour, the burden. I think what you have to be careful about is not you're then kind of putting all the responsibility on your ethnic minority employees to make the change. You can listen to their views and they can advise and they can be part of the change, but the entire company needs to be part of that change. So it's not about delegating responsibility to a particular group. It's about involving that group in the decision to change. And I think that sometimes that gets missed. It's like, I have seen examples of like, we've got this group, they're going to sort it out. And I was like, no, they're not going to sort it out. We're all going to sort it out, but they are going to be part of the solution. So I think that's really an important distinction.
Yeah. And there's a great conversation going on in chat comments. So please, everyone, do continue that. It's really great to see members and people joining this conversation, sharing their own insights, sharing their own experiences, their own practical examples of running or having joined a staff network. So that's great. And it actually kind of brings us towards the 3/4 mark on this conversation. So if you do have questions, please do consider submitting them now so that we've got the opportunity to try and answer a couple more. But one of the things we talk about in Moving the Dial on Race is that a powerful act of allyship is to keep ourselves up to date with current acceptable terminology. We also received many questions on the topic of microaggressions, which was actually a topic of a previous webinar, so I highly recommend people to revisit that one. But I'd like to hear the views of the panel, and Scarlett, perhaps if we start with you, how can we proactively keep ourselves up to date with current acceptable terminology when it comes to race and ethnicity?
Yeah, I like that this question said the phrase current acceptable, because the language, to a large extent, it's a social construct that is designed for communication. So therefore, in a specific society or in a country, so therefore, if a society changes, if a country changes, this social phenomenon will change with it. And it's mostly driven by the collective intention of this linguistic community in that country. So the terminology and language used to describe race and ethnicity is a very, very complex one, and it's ever evolving. So it's unlikely to have at any given time a perfect terminology or this magic word to make everyone happy. So even what is acceptable probably is debatable depending on the context. So I think if we look at the context of a workplace, participate in a group like a REACH or inclusion and diversity champion group who has people compassionate about this topic, who will stay on top of what's the latest knowledge on this, then you will be able to know what is the most acceptable term to use right now. And then also, if there isn't a network like this, the things, I think the beauty about REACH for us is an employee grassroots network. So anyone can start one if you think it's a really important topic that your company should pay attention to. And also, I think it's also very important that to have an HR department in the company that is receptive and open to changes on languages used in an organization, and because they will help to make policy change and language change and also communicate the message to the wider organization. So the HR and the senior leadership team need to be on board to help on the language change and send this message to all the employees.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, I think, very comprehensive answer. So thanks so much. We've got more questions flying in. So I think actually, if Daljit and Cully, you'll allow me to kind of perhaps pose a couple more of those questions as well. We did say we'd try and get through as much as possible today, but obviously we are limited for time. So just continuing that conversation slightly, I think, and in actual fact, we received quite a few questions in advance about handling differences of opinions, especially when there's a difference of opinion either between the organization and a staff network or between individuals. And Sally's asked, how can we, or even should we, use collective terminology when individuals within a staff team have preferences for different terminology? She cites the example of some staff preferring BAME or Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic, and others, she says here, BIPOC, which, as we know, is an acronym in itself that's kind of come over from the USA, if I'm correct in suggesting that. So yeah, I guess kind of, perhaps if I start with you, Cully, on that question.
Yeah, no, I think first of all is, I don't think, well, from the work that we've done, individuals themselves would never use an acronym or an umbrella term to describe their identity. So, I would never say I'm BAME or POC or whatever, So I think, first of all, it's fundamentally understanding what the individual's point of view is. And I agree, as I think I mentioned before, the sort of differences. I had colleagues sort of email me saying, I don't like the census question. It doesn't describe how I describe myself, which I think is a fair point, because you cannot tell someone how they should be describing themselves. So I think it's about understanding where they're coming from, understanding what the term they would use. But I think it's also having that honest conversation. Why do we want to know what people's identity is? Is it because we are looking at things like the ethnicity pay gap? We need to, look at the profile of our staff. And then I suppose it's reaching some kind of compromise or consensus that would allow some aggregation of the data. But, fundamentally, I don't have a problem with people having different terms to describe themselves or different identities, because I think that, we are all very different, and we describe ourselves in different ways. But I think there's potentially, from an administrative point of view, as a business or as an organization, you might need some umbrella terms just for your data collection. So I think it's about sort of reaching that, that fine balance, I think, but also explaining why you're doing what you're doing, I think, fundamentally. So it's not seen as some sinister thing that you're trying to do.
Absolutely, and thanks to everyone in comments as well, answering one another's questions. It's great to see that interaction. Please do keep that continuing. So we are starting to draw towards a close, but I do think it brings us back to a question that we received from Anil. So how useful will the ethnicity pay gap reporting be if people choose not to give their ethnicity when they join? So this is an interesting question, and we know that declaration rates, so obviously ethnicity is a self-identity measure, and you have to encourage your employees and build trust in your employees in order to gather that data. And I think if we broaden it out slightly as well, Cully, in terms of research as well, this prefer not to say or not disclosing ethnicity issue. So perhaps we could go around the panel and just ask for some top tips there on how do we improve reporting of ethnicity and self-disclosure. So Cully, perhaps if I naturally start with you on that one.
Okay, yeah. So we have a similar issue that our ethnicity pay gap, we didn't have 100% ethnicity for all our employees, but we had a very, very high rate. So we were confident, it's reasonably kind of sound. But I think the key thing we found was just explaining why we're collecting it. It's that, like you say, it's that trust issue. What are you going to do with this data? How will it be used? I think it's being very clear up front. And we're a survey organisation, and still we had people who were, nervous about how the data was used. So it is about building that trust, and I think that is built through this conversation, through the networks, the advocacy of, why we're doing what we're doing.
Yeah, and just for the purpose of the fact we've got so many great questions coming through. So Daljit, this one seems like a good question to pose to you from Sue Jane. When you are funded by another organization, they often have their own data collection nuances, criteria, and guidelines which may not match yours. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's an interesting. We're going through that right now in the charity because the language that some funders are using is BAME, which includes refugee at the end. So it's been quite controversial. So the purposes of data collection, they're insistent that they want data in a certain way so they can feed back into their own corporate organisations. We're currently debating that in terms of what does that actually mean? Why do you need this data? How are you going to use it? For service users and staff, it's about providing the best service possible for vulnerable women and children that have been trafficked or groomed. So internally, we have our own data collection system that we're developing within the diversity and inclusion strand. But we have to, sadly, try and fit in with what funders are requesting as well, which is difficult, especially if you've got different funders. So the Home Office have one way of doing things. If you're getting funded by the police, I'm aware now their new language is going to be BAME. So that's another terminology that'll be used, and so on. So we're continuously evolving and changing, but recognising if you want your organisation or charity to survive, to provide a service to vulnerable people, then you've got to play the game to a certain extent. It doesn't mean you can't have conversations of trust within your infrastructure, because people do fear it. They're afraid to speak in networks because they don't want to be singled out, versus the service users saying, as long as you know about my culture, faith and belief, I'm not really bothered what box you put me into. So it's quite an interesting area, especially at Ashiana.
Yeah, and thanks to Rita as well, who's commented to say that apparently 360 Giving has produced a taxonomy for funders to standardize the collection of data for charities. So perhaps that's one for those who that question relates to most directly to have a look at as well. We are really coming towards the end. I think, there's been a great question as well. There's been a number of great questions, and obviously we've only had time to cover some of these. And we haven't really had a chance to move into intersectionality, which Patrick's question that's just come through does relate to. I wonder if instead of perhaps moving into what is a very, kind of another conversation in itself, probably, I imagine, if I could ask perhaps another one of the pre-submitted questions from an audience member, which says, how does our language create a true sense of inclusivity, recognizing generalization itself can marginalize? So I guess kind of to sum up the conversation we've had so far, if I ask each of you just to comment on inclusive language more broadly and avoiding generalizations, and perhaps bring out a specific practical example if you have one. So if I could ask, why don't we start with Cully and see if you...
Yeah, no, I think, sometimes it's good to generalize, but I think you have to be very careful to generalize because, you know, you are, like you say, potentially then labeling some groups or underrepresenting some groups. So again, I think it sort of boils down to where you can be as specific and nuanced as possible, but accept there might be times where you need those umbrella terms or the kind of collective sort of data. But I think your starting point would be try not to, you know, do not generalize if you can, because I think it, like you say, it's a very complex issue and it's very hard to generalize. You know, we shouldn't be, and this is one of the reasons I think we're having this conversation and this debate today.
Absolutely. And Michelle was just coming by saying, start by always using the actual words rather than BAME whilst we work out what to replace it with. And absolutely, again, if you've not already had a look at CMI's Moving the Dial on Race, there's some top tips in there, one of which is obviously to be specific and avoid generalizations as well. Scarlett, over to you about inclusive language and perhaps drawing from your experience of REACH.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Kelly said, you know, be specific to, you know, talk about the specific group, especially in talking about race and ethnicity. We know how many disparities there are between these groups. But I think generalization itself isn't anything wrong. You know, if you want to look at things on a more macro level, or reporting on a more general level, then you can do that. But it's important to understand why you want to do that in certain situation and be aware that you are doing that intentionally for a specific reason. It shouldn't really be used as like a lazy or simplistic way just to try to do a job quickly rather than dive into more detail that gives more information to address issues. So if you're aware you're doing that and for give people a good reason why you're doing it in this way, and it can also be acceptable at times.
And Daljit, if I give you 1 minute to wrap up very quickly on inclusive language.
That'll be fun, Matt. You've got to be brave, first of all, have those conversations, include everybody. Don't do things for the sake of it as a tick box. If you're using certain language and you're gathering certain data, demonstrate how you've used it to bring a change, be it in pay, be it in representation at a strategic level, maybe even introducing positive action. I'm not sure. Whatever works for your organisation, but respect that and be honest. If we've made mistakes and we've got it wrong, let's talk about it in order to move forward. If we don't, it's just going to fester in the minds of many that have been on a journey where they've tried to call out racism and it's just not happened.
I like the moving forward. I think that's a great, neat way to summarize our conversation. It is complex, as I think this conversation has shown. There's lots we weren't able to cover that we will be doing so, following up with resources and further conversations. But it's, I think, brought us to an end. So it just leaves me to thank everyone who joined us. Thanks for your comments, your discussion amongst one another, your questions to the panel. And obviously, thank you to Daljit, Scarlett and Cully for your insights and expertise. It's been fascinating. I'm sure everyone will agree with that. And if you are interested in finding out more about CMI Race, then there have been some links dropped in the chat throughout the conversation. And you can also visit the CMI website. If you're not yet a member, you can join our community to find out more about the different events and insight articles and other resources we make available as well. So thank you ever so much for joining. I'm really, really pleased that you're able to give up your time today to join our panel. And it goes without saying that it's been great. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.